Pneumonia after he'd been suffering from Alzheimer's disease for 10 years. And then we learned this week that his condition worsened with the onset of pneumonia. Nancy Reagan said just a few hours ago that this was it. Apparently she had called family members. His family members were by his side. At least we know his two of his children were by his side. He had been suffering for quite a while. The 40th president was known as the cheerful crusader who devoted his presidency to winning the Cold War, trying to scale back government and making people believe it was morning again in America. Once again, the president died on Saturday, today, just a few hours ago. He was 93 years old. We will certainly have much more on this very celebrated life of one of the most popular presidents. Our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, again died at the age of 93 at his home in Bel Air, California. This has been a Fox News Alert. And now we are going to be joined. We are back here live at Fox News, and we're talking about, once again, the death of our 40th president, Ronald Reagan. And
when he took office in January of 1981, you may well remember, high interest rates, astounding, 21%. Unemployment was very high. Inflation was very high. He reduced the tax rate and, in fact, invoked the largest tax cut in American history. But it was just about 3 months into his office when an assassin's bullet struck. He managed barely to survive. John Hinckley had fired 6 shots, wounding the president with one of the bullets. It came very close to his heart and punctured his lung, famously, as he was rolled into the hospital for emergency surgery. He looked around at the doctors and said, "Gee, I hope you're all Republicans." When Nancy finally got to his side, he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck." He maintained, even in the face of potential death, a sense of humor. He recovered quickly, but was faced with perhaps his first greatest challenge, the air traffic controllers' strike, which threatened to paralyze the nation's air system. And the President of the United States fired them all. Let's go now to Jim Engel, who's standing by with more. Jim?
Greg, we expect something from the president. Certainly this evening, the White House had indicated earlier that should Mr. Reagan pass away, that the president would say something fairly quickly. We don't know when. Obviously, the president was scheduled to retire early tonight. He's headed for D-Day celebrations tomorrow. Obviously, Ronald Reagan is one of the most beloved presidents of this century, certainly of the last 50 years. Was an amazing president. I had the honor of covering him for more than 5 years, and was a fascinating president, and as you remember, was very controversial. As we see demonstrations in Europe these days, it is nothing compared to the demonstrations we used to see against Ronald Reagan during some of the darkest days of the Cold War, when he was pressing the Soviet Union to disarm and being tough on the Soviet Union, and many Europeans were worried that he was actually going to create more difficulties than he was going to solve, and were dead set against him, at least until the mid-'80s, when he started to make progress, when Glasnost came along, when he started talking with Mikhail Gorbachev, and the two sides started to disarm. Ending the Cold War was his greatest legacy, but certainly not his only one. He is beloved by conservatives, was seen as the father of the modern conservative movement, and spent 8 years in the White House, and is still remembered fondly by not only Republicans, but by all Americans. Greg?
All right. Jim Engel reporting live in Paris. Jim, let me just build on some of your knowledge. If there is a singular line that defines presidents, and inevitably there is, would the sentence be, this is the man who helped bring about the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union? Would that be it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it. Here was a guy who stood his ground when everyone around him was saying, you are going too far, you're being too radical, you're pushing the Soviet Union too much, you're taking too many chances. He stood his ground, and eventually it paid off. You had Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to office. Essentially, President Reagan spent the Soviet Union into the ground by pushing a military buildup they could not match. Greg?
Jim Engel reporting live in Paris, and we know parenthetically the president's going to issue a written statement sometime this evening.